National Bolshevism, one of the more interesting political ideologies. For those of you that don't know, National Bolshevism is basically communism, but small businesses are allowed to be privately owned as long as the state doesn't see them as a threat to its socialism combined with radical nationalism. Oh yeah, and they hate Abrahamic religions, seeing them as Jewish identities opposed on non-Jewish peoples. The abbreviation of a National Bolshevik is Natzbol. So what if the Germans and Russians united under this interesting ideology? That is what I will answer today in this alternate history timeline. Since Hitler hated Slavs and communists, and would never align with them unless it was to take down other Slavs or communists, the first thing we have to do is take him out of the picture. After the conquest of Poland in this timeline, Hitler would die, and then the beliefs of the Nazis and the Soviets would mix, and then they'd unite under National Bolshevism, with a sort of pan-Northern European nationalism. Because of Germany's conversion to National Bolshevism, they'd end up alienating Franco and Mussolini, so Germany would have to end up going to war with Italy and Spain. The German Nazballs would easily conquer them, simply because Italy wasn't formidable and Spain was poor. Following the conquest of Spain, the Nazballs would redistribute the wealth from the traditional hierarchies Franco reinstalled to the Basques, Asturians, and other non-Hispanics that are more Northern European whom he bombed into poverty. The Germans still couldn't conquer Britain, however, because Britain had, well... Meanwhile, the Russian Nazballs and Imperial Japan would be teaming up in a scramble for China. That is, until Pearl Harbor happens, of course. Now it's time to say hello to the Cold War. The British give independence to the Indian subcontinent and the indo-pakistani wars begin. The Nazballs would support India against Pakistan because they'd see India as a fellow Indo-European pagan power, taking on the power of an Abrahamic faith. Another reason why they'd support India is because of the Indian caste system. It usually has the whiter Indians on top, and the Nazis believed that these whiter Indians were the descendants of ancient Aryans whom they believed were white people who intermarried with the darker peoples of India, creating the modern brown Indians. Brits would support Pakistan because when they ruled the subcontinent, their favourite Indians were the Muslims or the ancestors of modern-day Pakistanis. America would also support Pakistan, fearing the domino effect. They'd want to stop Bolshevism in its tracks. They'd use Jim Crow prejudice to help as a bias against India. India would dominate these wars with Pakistan, not only because they did so in our timeline, but also because they'd be receiving aid from two very nearby superpowers. Indians would place the darker Pakistanis in their conquered territory in gulags with conditions influenced by what the untouchables go through in India. The whiter Pakistanis would probably be converted to Hinduism. Along with fighting each other, the Nazballs and capitalists would want to show off what their systems can do. The Nazballs would invest in India, and the capitalists would invest in whatever is left over of Pakistan. That is, if there is anything left of Pakistan. If there is anything left over, Pakistan's leftover crumbs would receive heavy scientific advancement, while India would see an expansion in agricultural cultivation and widespread industrialization. Pakistan would still turn in on itself, turning to Wahhabism to gain rich Muslim allies against India like Saudi Arabia. Pakistan would become a tiny Saudi Arabia, which instead of thriving off of dinosaur juice money, barely gets by on hydroelectric energy and investment from the actual kingdom, Britain and the United States. On to Latin America and Africa. South Africa and the Nazballs would be a match made in heaven because apartheid is so similar to National Bolshevism. Africa would probably turn to it, redistributing wealth among the whites there and keeping the blacks right where they are to ensure the support from Nazballs in the South African border war against Namibia. Iran of Argentina's beliefs were very similar to Nazballism. It has a large northern European community and likes picking fights with its neighbours, making it another perfect candidate. The US would support Chile in wars with Peronist Nazball Argentina and maybe Bolivia in wars against Nazball Paraguay. After the death of Perón's wife, he would lose much of his influence and National Bolshevism in Argentina would gradually fade away. Many don't know this, but Che Guevara was quite racist, so he would probably become a Natsball. This means he'd probably be killed by native Bolivians or Peruvians before he can convert Castro. Even if he does live to help Fidel out, Mr. Castro would probably be repulsed by the racism, as he definitely wasn't racist, greatly raising black literacy rates in Cuba. So the Cuban Revolution would probably be like a French Revolution 2.0, ending up capitalist but guaranteeing a greater division of landed property and nominal establishment of equality among men. Maybe Batista would even get guillotined, but who knows. When it comes to Israel's conflicts with the Arabs would do much better since they would be receiving support from two superpowers, unlike our timeline where they only received help from one. Russia would be contributing far more to many of the proxy wars against America, and the largest single American ethnic group is German. The relationship between America and Germany would be a lot like the States' current relationship with China in our timeline. Lots of trade, but the fear of all-out war looms in the background. This means racism would be far more acceptable in the Western world. One's philosophy identifies itself in what the outside world is. A good example is Mao killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined, but since China is probably the West's biggest trade partner, we don't hear much about that. Racism has been disregarded because the major world powers which used racism as their core ideology, like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, were taken out by democratic capitalists or communists by the end of World War II. Because racism was taken out of the battlefield roughly 3 decades ago, the civil rights movement and decolonization had their paths paved out for them. The whole cultural revolution of the 60s would happen much later in this alternate timeline. I think the aspects relevant to civil rights and decolonization would happen in the 80s, since there was another kind of sort of revolution then. It's hard to say whether the Natsballs would be for or against figures like Saddam Hussein, since he was a big fan of Stalin and Hitler, but picked fights with whiter peoples like Kurds and Iranians. Many of these Kurds were Yazidis. Yazidis are a borderline pagan group. They're monotheistic, but they revere their angels like their gods, and he hated Iran, and Iran hates Israel. But then again, Saddam himself was anti-Zionist, so who knows? National Bolshevism survive into the 21st century? Well, the USSR had problems dealing with industrial changes, especially deindustrialization or post-industrialism onward. To be fair, it has been an issue world over. The National Bolsheviks do stand a chance though, since their economies would be a little bit more flexible than communism, since small businesses are allowed to be privately. Seeing how they deal with the oil shocks of the 70s would be very interesting, although I think Russia could help Natsball Germany with its own oil fields. How exactly their deal would work in specifics, I cannot say, but I imagine something like the energy deal Putin made with China a while back with that new pipeline. If the Natsball powers live on to see the wars with ISIS, and ISIS still becomes a thing in this alternate timeline, the Natsballs would support militias of minority religions that they are persecuting, excluding the other Abrahamic religions. My final notes on what alliances would look like and to whom would be more influential are that in Natsball Germany, Strasser, who believed in a more radical mass action and worker-based form of Nazism, but not from a racial, ethnic, or cultural or religious perspective, but from an anti-capitalist basis. To achieve natural rebirth, he wanted to redistribute wealth from the Jews to the Germans. I will do a video someday on what if Germans and Russians united under Straussite Nazism. Another note is that Russians are too big a threat for the Germans to just be hunky-dory with them. Both in our timeline and this alternate timeline, Germans hated Russians for things that had been going on from before World War I. Sheer momentum would make the Germans sign an alliance with China, who would be sour with Russia for what they did in this timeline's World War II to spite Russia. This web of alliances would be like our timeline's web of alliances in East Asia, where Japan and South Korea have been fighting over land for a very long time, and North Korea hates them both for obvious reasons, and because China has been in any squabbles with North Korea, and also has sour relationships with Japan, and even though they're best friends with North Korea, South Korea has a much better relationship with China than it does with Japan. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and support me on PayPal if you can.